The lights in the sold-out arena burned bright, casting long shadows across the mat. The energy in the air was electric, the kind of tension that made even seasoned fighters uneasy. Fans had packed every seat, millions more watching from screens around the world. It was a matchup no one had ever imagined, yet here it was Khabib Nurmagomedov, the undefeated champion, stepping into the cage against a man whose world had never revolved around combat. Mark Zuckerberg, the billionaire tech mogul, the mind behind Facebook, stood across from him, his expression unreadable. For weeks, the fight had been dismissed as a joke, an absurd spectacle that had no place in professional combat. Khabib was a machine, a force of nature forged in the mountains of Dagestan, a man who had mauled the greatest fighters in the world with relentless pressure and precision. Zuckerberg, by contrast, was a programmer, an entrepreneur, a strategist in the world of algorithms and virtual connections, but now, he was standing in the most unforgiving environment known to man. As the referee signaled for the fighters to approach, the crowd erupted. Some were cheering, some were laughing, but all of them were watching. Khabib moved with the calm, measured confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Zuckerberg, on the other hand, walked forward with a controlled posture, his breathing steady. A commentator leaned into his mic, barely able to contain his disbelief. "Folks, we are about to witness something historic, but the question is why? Why would Mark Zuckerberg step into the cage with Khabib?" That question had haunted the fight world since the announcement. Zuckerberg wasn't just here for fun. Something bigger was at play. The tech billionaire had spent months in private training, surrounding himself with elite fighters, scientists, and even data analysts. While most saw this as nothing more than a rich man's experiment, those who had been paying attention noticed something different. Zuckerberg wasn't treating this as entertainment. He was treating it as research. Khabib, ever the professional, showed no emotion as he stepped into position. He had fought some of the most dangerous men on the planet, but never had he faced someone like this. He had been raised in an environment where weakness was a death sentence, where every moment of his life had been dedicated to discipline, struggle, and mastery. Zuckerberg, on the other hand, had built an empire through intellect, control, and the power of information. Two vastly different worlds, now colliding in the most primal way possible. The bell rang. Khabib closed the distance instantly, his footwork smooth, effortless. He wasn't here to play. His plan was simple: pressure Zuckerberg, take him down, and end it quickly. He had done it to world champions, and he would do it again. But something was wrong. Zuckerberg didn't panic. He didn't freeze. Instead, he moved not with the awkward hesitation of an amateur, but with the calculated precision of a man who had studied every possible scenario. He sidestepped, his reactions unnervingly sharp. His defense wasn't perfect, but it was far better than it should have been. Khabib barely acknowledged it. He pressed forward, feinting a right hand before dropping low for the takedown. No one had ever stopped it before. Zuckerberg reacted instantly. He sprawled not just defensively, but with a counter movement that had been drilled to perfection. His hips dropped, his arms shot into position, and for a brief moment, the impossible happened. Khabib's momentum stalled. A hush fell over the crowd. The undefeated champion adjusted, using his sheer strength to drive forward, but Zuckerberg had anticipated it. He pivoted, creating just enough space to slip free and reset. Khabib stood up, his expression unchanged, but his mind was racing. The arena was silent for half a second before the crowd erupted in disbelief. The commentators scrambled for words. Zuckerberg just defended a Khabib takedown. What are we witnessing? No one had expected this. Everyone had assumed this would be over in seconds, that Zuckerberg would be ragdolled like countless others before him. And yet, here he was, standing his ground, his eyes locked onto Khabib's like a man who had seen this moment 1,000 times before. In the VIP section, a group of analysts watched with growing intensity. One of them, a former champion, turned to his colleague. "This isn't just training," he muttered. "This is something else." Khabib adjusted his stance, his mind shifting gears. He had never been one to underestimate an opponent, but now, for the first time in years, he realized this was not going to be a normal fight. Zuckerberg exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. His movements, his reactions. They weren't natural. He wasn't just well trained. He was prepared in a way that didn't make sense. Something bigger was happening here. And Khabib was about to find out exactly what it was. The moment lingered longer than it should have. Khabib had never been in a fight where his opponent's movements felt calculated. Not instinctual, not desperate, but something else entirely. Zuckerberg stood across from him, calm, controlled, and strangely aware. The crowd's roaring disbelief echoed through the arena, but inside the cage, there was only silence between them, a silence Khabib had learned to read long ago. He feinted another level change, testing Zuckerberg's reaction. The billionaire didn't flinch, didn't overcommit to a counter. He adjusted just enough, a precise shift in weight that was almost too perfect. That was the moment Khabib knew this wasn't normal. This wasn't a man who had simply trained hard. Outside the cage, far from the bright lights and screaming fans, another kind of battle was unfolding. In a darkened control room deep within the arena, a team of analysts watched multiple screens, each displaying real-time data on Zuckerberg's movements, heart rate, and reaction speeds. One monitor showed a 3D simulation, mapping the fight in predictive sequences. A man in a crisp black suit leaned closer, murmuring into a headset. Synchronization holding at 98%. No anomalies detected. He's adapting as projected. A woman beside him tapped a holographic interface, her voice low but urgent. Khabib is unpredictable. If he recognizes the pattern, we might have to adjust. The man exhaled sharply. No need. Let him figure it out. That's part of the test. Back in the cage, Khabib shifted his stance. He had never needed to overthink a fight before. His pressure, his takedown chain, and his suffocating control had always broken even the toughest opponents. But now, an unfamiliar thought crossed his mind: he couldn't fight Zuckerberg the way he had fought anyone else. He moved in again, but this time, instead of forcing the takedown, he baited a reaction. Zuckerberg twitched slightly, shifting his stance in what should have been an unnoticeable movement, but Khabib saw it. It was subtle, deliberate, and precisely calculated. It was the kind of adjustment a human shouldn't be able to make in real time. A flicker of understanding crossed Khabib's eyes. He wasn't just fighting a man. He was fighting a system. In the VIP section, a few figures in expensive suits exchanged glances. One of them, an older gentleman with an air of quiet authority, watched intently. "He knows," he said under his breath. The others remained silent, waiting. Inside the cage, Zuckerberg exhaled. His confidence hadn't wavered, but something had shifted. He wasn't just reacting anymore, he was waiting. Testing. Khabib's mind worked quickly. He had spent years mastering control, breaking opponents not with brute force, but with relentless pressure, forcing them into positions where their choices were taken away. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he was the one being studied. The next exchange was faster than the audience could fully process. Khabib feinted a left, drove forward, but instead of taking Zuckerberg down, he switched mid-motion, attacking from an angle no one had ever countered before. Zuckerberg adjusted instantly. The entire arena seemed to hold its breath. Khabib wasn't just fighting anymore, he was hunting for the truth. Khabib's instinct screamed at him something was wrong. He had fought some of the most dangerous men on the planet, trained with warriors who had spent their entire lives preparing for battle, but never had he faced someone who moved like this. Zuckerberg wasn't just reacting, he was anticipating. It was as if he had already seen every attack before it happened. The undefeated champion lunged again, shifting levels, feinting high before snapping low for a single leg takedown. This time, he didn't expect the first move to work, it was bait. The real strike was in the follow-up, an instant adjustment meant to break his opponent's rhythm. And yet, Zuckerberg moved at the exact right moment, redirecting rather than resisting, his body turning just enough to neutralize the attack without committing to a counter. Khabib disengaged, stepping back just slightly. It wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. His eyes narrowed as he watched Zuckerberg's breathing, his stance, the slight flickers of movement in his hands. This wasn't muscle memory. This was something else. In the control room, tension spiked. A new line of data scrolled across one of the monitors, flashing in red. The woman monitoring the system's performance leaned forward, her voice sharp. "He's adjusting too quickly. He's deviating from the model." The man in the black suit frowned. "By how much?" "Enough that we can't predict the next exchange." The older gentleman in the VIP section tapped his fingers against the armrest, his expression unreadable. He had seen enough fights to know when something unnatural was happening. This wasn't a well-trained man holding his own against a champion, this was something entirely different. Back in the cage, Zuckerberg's confidence hadn't wavered, but his eyes flickered with something close to curiosity. Khabib, still as a statue, finally spoke for the first time since the fight had begun. "You're not fighting me," he said quietly. "You're running a program." A ripple of shock passed through the VIP section. The analysts in the control room went silent. Zuckerberg blinked. It was only for a fraction of a second, but Khabib saw it, the smallest crack in the facade. Then, for the first time, Zuckerberg attacked. It was a blur of motion, faster than anyone expected. He lunged not wildly, not recklessly, but with a precision that was eerily efficient. His strike was perfectly timed, aimed at exploiting the exact moment Khabib was off balance. But Khabib wasn't off balance. He had been waiting. Zuckerberg's fist sailed past Khabib's jaw as the Dagestani warrior pivoted, trapping the arm in a split-second clinch. A heartbeat later, he had Zuckerberg's back, his grip tightening like a vice. The billionaire twisted, trying to break free, but Khabib's control was suffocating. The arena roared. The commentators lost their minds. But then it happened. A shift, so small it was almost imperceptible. Zuckerberg adjusted in a way no human should have been able to. His spine arched at an angle that defied normal flexibility, his escape movement calculated to the millimeter. And just like that, he was free. Khabib released him, stepping back, his expression unreadable. But inside, he felt it, something was very, very wrong. Zuckerberg straightened, rolling his shoulders as if nothing had happened. His breathing was still controlled, his stance relaxed. But Khabib knew the truth now. This wasn't just a man who had trained. This was something else entirely. And for the first time in his career, he didn't know what he was fighting. The weight of the moment settled between them. Khabib had fought men who were faster, stronger, and more ruthless, but none had ever made him feel like this, as if he was up against something that wasn't playing by the same rules. Zuckerberg's expression remained eerily neutral, his breath steady, his movements precise. It was no longer just a fight. It was something else entirely. Khabib tightened his stance, watching for even the slightest tell. But that was the problem, there were none. Zuckerberg moved with a rhythm that felt unnatural, not because it was unpredictable, but because it was too predictable. A fighter reacts based on instinct, emotions, fear, and pain. Zuckerberg reacted like he was executing commands, like every motion had been predetermined before the fight even started. Then, without warning, Zuckerberg struck again. He came forward in a blur, his attack so precise that Khabib had only a fraction of a second to react. He slipped the first shot, blocked the second, but the third, an elbow from an angle no trained fighter should have thrown, clipped his shoulder. It wasn't the power that unsettled him. It was the execution. Khabib countered instantly, grabbing Zuckerberg's wrist and dragging him into the clinch. This was his world, where there was no escape, no algorithm that could outmatch raw, unrelenting control. He locked his hands around Zuckerberg's waist, driving him backward, slamming him against the cage. The moment they hit, Khabib whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. "What are you?" Zuckerberg didn't answer. Instead, his body shifted just slightly, just enough to angle himself for an escape. And then Khabib felt it. Not strength. Not technique. Something mechanical. A split-second hesitation was all Zuckerberg needed. He twisted with an inhuman level of precision, breaking free in a way that defied natural movement. Khabib staggered back, his instinct screaming at him. He had felt muscle before, resistance, the energy of a real opponent. But this? The crowd didn't notice it. The commentators chalked it up to unorthodox movement. But Khabib knew. In the control room, alarms flashed red. The woman monitoring the data turned sharply toward the man in the suit. He overcompensated. That wasn't supposed to happen. The man's face darkened. He's exposed. In the VIP section, the older gentleman tapped his fingers one last time before standing. He had seen enough. The test was over. Back inside the cage, Khabib wasn't thinking about victory anymore. He was thinking about the implications. He had dedicated his life to breaking men, to exposing weaknesses and finding the limits of the human body. But he wasn't fighting a man. He stepped forward, ready to push again, but something changed. Zuckerberg didn't move. He stood still, blinking once, as if processing something beyond the fight itself. Then, almost imperceptibly, his lips curled into a slight smile. Not of triumph. Not of arrogance. But of understanding. Then the referee stepped in. It was over. The crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and confusion. The official decision didn't matter. Khabib barely registered it. He only saw Zuckerberg standing there, unmoved, unshaken, untouched in a way no man should be. As he walked away from the cage, Khabib didn't hear the post-fight interviews. He didn't hear the commentators trying to break down what had just happened. His mind was on one thing. He had just fought the future. And the world didn't even realize it yet.